This is Steve Zeltzer with KPFA WorkWeek Radio, and there's been an ongoing controversy about the Arnautoff Murals at George Washington High School in San Francisco, and whether or not the depiction of the treatment of Native Americans in California and other areas of history should be taken down because they offend the students. And this is obviously an important issue, particularly in San Francisco, with many murals in San Francisco about the history of California, slavery, and other issues. Joining us today is Gray Brechin, who is probably one of the foremost historians of California history, particularly with his book, Imperial San Francisco, about the role of the large capitalist families in California who really use their power and their wealth to lead the development of California, shall we say. So welcome to WorkWeek Radio.
Thanks, Steve.
Why don't you talk about how this mural controversy developed and why it's important for people to understand it's just not about the murals, it's about our history and understanding our history.
Well, the first thing is that you have to understand that during the New Deal, during the 1930s, there was an agency called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, under Harry Hopkins, and it was meant to put lots and lots of people to work, and it did. It put about 8.5 million Americans to work, doing everything from paving roads to building sewers and parks and all. But there was a small division of it which was dedicated to the arts: music, theater, writing, and the visual arts. And it was small, but it employed thousands of artists to do public art in post offices and mural and schools, libraries, public spaces. And so one of those murals, well, the first of them was actually in Coit Tower. And those are quite famous, and some of them were...
That was in the middle of the general strike. That was, and they tried to ban that. They had to guard it.
That's right. That actually wasn't done under the WPA. It was done under its predecessor, the Civil Works Administration. But it was 1933-34, right in the winter there, and there were over 20 artists who worked on murals, and most of them are non-controversial. They just show people working, doing their stuff, but there are some that are pretty controversial. They were edgy because the artists at that time were radicalized, like so many others at the time during the Great Depression. They knew that capitalism had essentially brought the whole economy down. And so they wanted to do a critique of it. And so they did in Coit Tower. One of those artists was Victor Arnautoff. Very interesting Russian-American artist. He was a card-carrying communist, actually. He worked with Diego Rivera in Mexico on some of the great murals down there. He was nobody's fool about oppressed classes and racism. And so he did a mural for Coit Tower called City Lights, in which it made some very powerful people quite unhappy. In Arnautoff's murals, he had left-wing newspapers, for example. He did not have the Chronicle in a newsstand. He had the New Masses and various others, instead of the Chronicle. And that got the Chronicle very upset, and the DeYoung family. But he also has a very well-dressed businessman standing in the middle of the financial district being held up by somebody who's filching his wallet at the same time. Well, the Chamber of Commerce didn't like that very much. There's a car crash on the street. And
a wreck of capitalism.
Exactly, yeah. And so they were one of the murals that actually got him and the other lefty artists in trouble. And especially the general strike at the same time. So that had to be closed for a while because, of course, the Park Commission said they were worried about vandalism of the murals. So they closed the whole thing so that people couldn't see.
That was for years.
No, it was only for a few months, right after the general strike, because the Hearst papers, the Examiner really went after them, all these commie artists who were there, only a few of whom really were.
Well, at that time, the Chronicle was saying there was a revolution in San Francisco. The Reds were taking over San Francisco.
Oh, yeah. No, there were calls raining on, the Roosevelt administration saying, you've got to do something because revolution's breaking out here on the West Coast, and if you don't do something, it'll spread.
Bring in the army.
Bring in the army, Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, actually stopped them from coming in, because she knew that it might just incite a revolution. She was later on, very nearly impeached for doing that, actually.
And basically, the demands of the longshoremen were not revolution, but a union hiring hall.
Yes.
I mean, basic rights, union rights were actually the actual demands.
Yes, that's right. And many of the artists, of course, were sympathetic with them, but also they were incensed by the fact that Diego Rivera's great murals at Rockefeller Center had been destroyed by order of the Rockefeller family because they showed Karl Marx, and I think that was
Trotsky.
Trotsky, I think, was in there, and they showed syphilis spirochetes swarming towards the capitalists and things like that. So they were destroyed. So the artists in San Francisco were quite upset about that.
And Victor Arnautoff, who is the artist that did the murals in George Washington High, actually was a graphic artist and did graphics for the general strike to support the strike at that time.
That's right. He was a very left-leaning artist, even though he was actually from a fairly aristocratic Russian family, but he was radicalized by the Great Depression, like so many others were. And so he did several other frescoes in San Francisco, the greatest of which is the incidents in the life of George Washington at the new George Washington High School, which was built by the Public Works Administration, another New Deal agency. It's a magnificent building designed by the great Art Deco architect from San Francisco, Timothy Pfluger, who also happened to be great friends with Rivera and Frida Kahlo and all the artists at that time. And he designed the building, and then he probably got the commission for Arnautoff to do these murals. Well, Arnautoff did 13 murals that are not what you would normally expect to see at that time about the founder of our country. Scenes of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and telling the truth about it, and surging.
He was a truth teller in that.
He was a truth teller, yeah.
That got him in trouble.
Some of our subsequent presidents, or rowing across the Delaware or any of that stuff. No, what he did was he showed George Washington with his slaves at Mount Vernon, and most controversially, he shows George Washington, who was a surveyor, by the way, pointing the settlers west, and they're walking over the body of a dead Indian towards a campfire where a white settler is smoking a peace pipe with an Indian. And presumably, of course, that treaty will be broken. As almost all the treaties were. In the background is the skyline of San Francisco with the fog pouring through it. So what he was saying here is that Washington was not only the father of the genocide of the Native Americans, but in fact that was critical to building great cities like San Francisco. Now, it was meant to be critical because these murals are very, very colorful, all of them, except for the settlers fully armed with pickaxes and rifles, walking over the body of a dead Indian. They are in ghostly gray, which means that it's actually a death march over this very colorful body of a fallen Indian brave. So he's actually being critical of this. He's showing what nobody else was showing at that time, that Washington owned slaves and that he was largely responsible for what becomes known as manifest destiny and the slaughter of the people who lived here before. Well, I've never understood how he could get away with it at that time.
Because was there any controversy when those murals were painted at the high school?
I have not found any controversy, which really surprises me because every time I go in there and I see them, I go, whoa, how did he get away with this? Because it's obviously very provocative today.
It's a challenge to
It's a challenge
the
for anybody who's looking at it, And for years, of course, the students would say, meet me at the dead Indian. So the students, of course, noticed this, and it became sort of a local landmark at the high school with the students. So much so that in the 1970s, it was with the rise of student activism, of course, there were students in the school, which was becoming much more diverse at that time. It wasn't all white as it had been largely when the school was built. It was becoming much more diverse. And the students said that they wanted it destroyed. And the school administration said, no, these are works of art. You know, they were painted by the and for the WPA, and they're historical, and they're also multi-layered. And so they said, no, we don't think it should be destroyed. What they did was an interesting compromise. They hired a young African-American artist named Dewey Crumpler to come in and do a very large mural in an adjacent hallway, which shows people of all ethnicities rising from oppression in and achieving their dream and helping to build the United States as well, too.
An opposite to just the destruction of U.S. capitalism and what imperialism was doing to the
Well, from the
Native
way that
Americans.
the students and their parents were interpreting it at that time, that it was offensive, to some people, because I think they didn't understand that art, at least, the best art, is many layered and it has different layers of meaning to it. They were just seeing the surface of it and it was offensive to them. And so the administration at that time struck a compromise, which held for a number of decades up until quite recently, when it no longer holds, actually.
So the latest controversy over the murals are that the students are saying that they don't like looking at this, that this is shows the tragedy of American history, and that that's damaging to them, and they should be removed. So what has happened in this controversy? So this controversy, as you say, has garnered international coverage, national coverage, and become an important story about art and about what art represents and whether this kind of art should be protected.
Yes.
For young people especially.
Well, it's become a controversy not only about art, but also about history. What do we want to remember? And so what has happened is that some of the students, African American and Native Americans, said that these make them very uncomfortable, that they can't look at them when they come in the main lobby, so they have to go in the side door because it's so uncomfortable. And
So I guess it's hitting home.
it is hitting home, which is what Arnautoff wanted it to, although I don't think he meant it to trigger African Americans and Native Americans. He wanted it to trigger whites, actually, so that they would understand what their ancestors were largely responsible for. That's not the way it's being interpreted. And I think it's largely driven more by the parents of these kids. They're saying that the students should not be exposed to something that makes them feel uncomfortable. And so it has become national, and I would say even international, that this would be happening in this liberal city, San Francisco, and the implications are pretty uncomfortable because it's so analogous to book burning by people who don't want to know what's in the books that they are destroying. It's somewhat analogous to that because we know that these murals are controversial, but they're also complex, and that you have to understand the complexity. They're now historic. They're by a well-known artist, and they were meant to do exactly the opposite of what the people who were attacking them claim that they do. I attended the last of the 4 reflection and action meetings that the school board called to decide what to do about the murals. And I was there, and it was clear that what those of us who were testifying in their favor for their preservation, that none of that mattered. The people who were on the steering committee had their minds made up, and so they adjourned for an hour, and they came back with the decision which they would give to the school board. And it blew me away when I heard it, because they said that these murals actually glorify racism, genocide, white supremacy, manifest destiny, etc., when in fact they do exactly the opposite. And so they hadn't heard anything that had been said, in particular by Professor Robert Cherney, who is Arnautoff's biographer, who had previously given testimony about Arnautoff's intentions and had been essentially told to sit down and shut up, that he had insulted school board members by telling them what Arnautoff's intentions really were. They simply don't want to hear that. They know what they know and know what they see. And so what they recommended to the school board is that go the extra mile, not just destroy the two controversial murals, but destroy all 13 of them at the same time.
Finish them all off.
Finish them all off. I mean, why leave anything? So they're to be digitally archived and then whitewashed, and presumably replaced with murals that glorify these groups. I presume, because Dewey Crumpler's murals are not sufficient at this time in the 21st century, but to just go the extra mile.
Now, this issue of monuments, I think, has been become a national issue in the United States, particularly because of a movement to get rid of the Confederate monuments in the South.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, Trump made the argument that if you're going to take those monuments down, maybe you should take down the monuments of Washington, who was a slaveholder,
Yes.
which most people don't even know about that part of the history. But this whole controversy about our history of the American people, and paintings that reflect that history, that should be covered over because it shows a terrible part of American history.
Well, that's exactly correct. You know, the difference, I think, and as you said, it all starts with the move to remove Confederate monuments. I think that's a different case because those are definitely racist. We know that they didn't go up at the time of the Civil War, right after it. They went up with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and they were meant to...
And the destruction of Reconstruction.
Yes, and they were meant to justify Jim Crow and racial segregation, etc., when it was starting to come under attack, I mean, well before the Civil Rights Act. So that's a completely different case than these. These are much more complex. But as you say, I mean, it's not just art that's being put on trial, it's history itself. And so I look back at the largely forgotten trial of the Rincon annex murals, which was in 1953 during the McCarthy period, in which another set of New Deal murals painted for Rincon Annex Post Office in San Francisco were put on trial in Washington, D.C. because they showed aspects of San Francisco's history that many whites at that time found very uncomfortable. The violence, the racial violence, etc., a lynching, the general strike, Harry Bridges. Anton Refregier, the artist, had actually shown blacks going off to fight in the war and sitting at the UN table. And the Hearst Press found that just too much. And so it's a fascinating trial. I've written about it. And what it turned out is that the artist, Anton Refregier, who was a good friend of Arnautoff, they were both Russian Americans, and they both went back to live in the Soviet Union and do their art at the end of their lives.
In possibly because of the witch hunt and the attack on communists in the United States.
I think so. I think they just felt uncomfortable about being in a country that, in fact, was so comfortable with destroying art and altering its history for the ruling people, the whites, you know. So what happened was, it turned out in that day of testimony, which is in the congressional record, that Anton Refregier actually knew San Francisco history much better than the congressmen who were attacking him, one of whom was, or had been, Richard Nixon, when he was a representative from Southern California. He was one of the ones who initiated the trial, but by that time he was vice president. So what happens is it's history on trial, as at George Washington High School, history is being put on trial. But the artist actually knew the history much better than the attackers knew it. And that was pointed out at the time, and I think that the same is true today, that we now know that Washington and Jefferson had slaves. We now know that there was a genocide. what are we going to do about it? Are we going to erase it? And so, what I find interesting about the current controversy in listening to the people who want to destroy the murals is I can't figure out from their statements whether they want the genocide that happened here remembered or forgotten. Now, I know about it because I wrote a book that came out in 1999 called Farewell Promised Land about what happened in California, and I was shocked myself to find out the brutality, the cruelty, the almost total extermination of the native peoples here. It wasn't total, and they want that.
Thousands of people were driven out.
I've heard
Genocide.
as high as 95% of native Californians were killed at that time. And it wasn't just by slaughter, it was also by disease and other things as well, too. There were some who survived, and they're with us today. And, they don't want to be forgotten. They don't want to be invisible. Absolutely. But there was a genocide here, which very few Californians are aware of. I have long advocated that as there are memorials and museums to the genocide of the Holocaust in Europe, there should be one in California so that white people would know what happened to the natives. I mean, there is a museum to the California Indians there, but I think that there should be something about the brutality of what happened here and how this state was really built. Now, that would have to be left up to the native Californians here. It's not me to make that decision.
But that was a Holocaust.
It was a Holocaust. It was, in fact, if the numbers that I have are correct, it was far greater than the Holocaust of Jews in Europe. Because it was far more than, half. As I said, I've heard numbers up to 95% of the people who were here. That is a genocide.
And why hasn't this school board said, why don't we use this as a learning opportunity and have classes, have presentations, have documentation, even plaques about the real history, saying what this is, so that people understand that Victor Arnautoff, was actually saying this is the reality.
Yes.
Not we support this, but this is the real reality of American history and California history.
Well, there are many people, parents and others, since this became controversial, who are saying just that. In fact, I've talked to teachers at George Washington High School, and they're saying that they have used it for decades as a teaching moment. This is what art is, that it has layers, it's complex. We need to understand it as we need to understand history. They've been using it. That's not good enough for the people today. They just want it destroyed. And so it is a teaching moment. Now, what I also discovered when I went to these meetings was that the textbook curriculum has not been changed since 1995. They're in the process of revising the textbooks now. So
that could be even included in the textbooks, these murals and the history, and so that people can understand this is the reality. It is not pretty, but this is our history.
When you understand the cultural changes that have happened in the last 25 years since those textbooks were published, we now know these things that people weren't taught at that time. So the new textbooks, I'm sure, will have information about slavery, about the Middle Passage, about the genocide of Native Americans in it. That will probably not be enough. The murals themselves should have signs on them. Perhaps there should be video interpretation. I mean, there are all kinds of things we can do with multimedia now today at the same time. And I think also that there should probably be more murals at other parts in the high school, contemporary murals like Dewey Crumpler's, that show the achievements of Filipinos, for example. And
who were also hung in lynchings in San Francisco.
Oh, it was really brutal, But one other thing about the murals that are so controversial that I brought up in some of the articles is that this is it's an allegorical representation of genocide. It is not the actual acts, which were incredibly violent and brutal. It's not that. It's these ghost-like pioneers walking over the body of a dead Indian. There's another mural in San Francisco painted by Anton Refregier at Rincon Annex, which is violent. It shows Irish workers brutally attacking Chinese workers, cutting off their queues and beating them. And so you could have Chinese, you could have Irish complaining about those as well too, that it's an unfair representation or it makes them uncomfortable to look at. I haven't heard that so far. Perhaps I shouldn't have even mentioned that. But you see, this is the slippery slope that we go on if we allow this to happen. And I think that's why it's become an international cause célèbre, because if these murals can be destroyed, then no work of art that offends anybody is going to be safe. And there's a lot of art that does that. As an art historian, I can think of, for example, 18th century paintings of, animals killed, for marketplaces and hunters holding up dead animals, etc. Well, vegans are going to be very upset about that, about the brutality of what we have done to the natural world, for example. Are we to destroy those too? It's just, it really wouldn't stop if you allow this to actually happen. Art is complex. But there also is the point that many of the artworks created at that time were, by our standards, racist. And frankly, I don't know what to do about that. They're historic, but those were the values of the time. There's another artwork, a WPA mural at a high school in Oak Park, Illinois, that was just removed by the school board because it shows children playing in the winter and the summer, and except they're all white. And the school now is largely African American and others, and they say that doesn't represent us. So they removed that, even though it's quite innocuous.
Is this political correctness that the right talks about?
Oh, yeah, I think that is political correctness. For me, it's a bit...
I mean, they could have murals of the present population of the school.
Well, they could have that as well, too. I think that they should be there. But that is an accurate representation of the demography of Oak Park at that time when that school was largely white. And it's really quite innocuous. I interviewed one of the last living WPA artists at her home. She was nearing 100. She was in New Jersey, and I interviewed her. And she told me that she had painted a mural for a post office in Michigan that the postmaster had ripped off the wall as soon as it was installed. And I said, well, Gertrude, why did he do that? And he said, well, I think it's because I showed blacks and whites working and playing together, and he didn't like that. That's in Michigan. That's what can happen when people don't understand what's going on or are in some ways, offended by it.
And San Francisco, of course, was a center of murals in the 30s and 40s. And you have spent a good deal of your life now writing about it and taking tours in San Francisco during Labor Fest as a cultural festival commemorating the San Francisco General Strike. Did you ever think that you'd be in a battle here to protect a mural by Victor Arnautoff today?
I couldn't have imagined that I'd ever be in a battle about an Arnautoff mural because he's so left-wing, and he knew exactly what he was doing. As I say, he'd worked with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so I just couldn't imagine being in a position like this. But there you go. And in some ways I'm responsible for it because I've taught, what happened to California natives, what happened to African
in your works of history.
I've written about it. At one of this last meetings, a young native Californian lectured us on the Bloody Island Massacre, which happened in Clear Lake, and I wrote about it in my book. I wrote about the Indian Island Massacre up at Eureka that Bret Hart had to get out of town for because he actually objected to the brutality of this massacre at that time, and they ran him out of town. So I'm no stranger to this, but of course it's not my ancestors who suffered these terrible indignities. My ancestors were Welsh. They came over here to dig coal for the man. And as far as I know, they didn't have slaves. But they were working class people, So When you come down to controversies like this, I think it's best to heed the advice of a guy 2,000 years ago who said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." You know, you look back at historical characters like Jefferson, Washington, even Teddy Roosevelt. They're very complex characters, like all of us should be, I hope. They weren't perfect by any means, but neither are we. I'm certainly not.
Well, also the whole idea of covering up our history, and this was the history of California and the United States. Where does that lead to?
That's right. Yeah, where does it lead to if you start erasing what actually happened here? And that's why I say I don't know whether these people want to remember or to forget. I'm not sure that they know. But I've never forgotten being in Berlin one time and being out on a great public space there and seeing a monument to the book burnings that happened there. And what they've done is you walk out to the center of this big plaza, there's a thick plate of glass, and you look down through the plate of glass and you see a very large room with empty bookshelves. And it's so haunting. It's so moving. It brings people to tears because that's where the books were piled up that the Nazis didn't want to know what was inside. They had been told what was inside those books, and they set fire to them so that nobody else would know what was in those books.
And do you think as a result of this controversy, there will be growing awareness of the need to protect these artworks? And also, why not another movement of hiring thousands of artists, many of whom are unemployed today, and to continue this art development?
Well, of course, I'd love to see a new WPA again. I mean, we've got so many people who are either unemployed or underemployed.
In the gig economy.
In the gig economy. I mean, you know, they say that the economy's never done better and unemployment's never been so low. Then why do we see this explosion of homelessness all over the place? Why do we see so many people who are living paycheck to paycheck and who hate their work as, you know, Amazon warehouse suppliers or flipping burgers or something? We need work that not only pays a living wage, but which is socially uplifting to the people in the way that the work back 80 years ago was with these artists. So we need to employ artists because so many of the artists now can't afford to live in our cities anymore. They're being forced out. And what cities do is, as San Francisco used to, say in North Beach, for example, is artists like to be together so that they can, you know, their ideas can ferment in cafes and places where they can drink cheap vino, you know, and where there's an air of tolerance.
That's the history of San Francisco. It has been.
It's the
until the present, with the billionaires taking over the city completely.
It's not only San Francisco, you know, it's Greenwich Village, it's, you know, the Paris Left Bank. There's a certain critical mass where artists get together, which doesn't presumably happen in places like Modesto, for example. But that's where artists, if they can afford to live in California at all, are being forced out to. So we need to have projects that, in fact,
isn't that socialism?
it sounds awfully like that, yes. But
I mean, actually employing artists and actually putting people to work at real jobs?
Yes, and to do controversial things because it's really hard to keep artists on a tight leash. You know, they're really herding cats. And the artist administrators at that time knew that. But yeah, I mean, you know, my own feeling is that the New Deal was headed for socialism. It was a kind of gradual process. But if you look at Roosevelt's last and greatest State of the Union address, the second Bill of Rights speech, in fact, in 1944, it sure looks like socialism. It didn't go by that name, but I think we were headed in that direction, and then Roosevelt died.
Well, the issue of a right to a job,
yes,
the right to health care, the right to a free education, those right-wing politicians are saying that is socialism.
Yes, they certainly are. But it's written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course comes right out of the New Deal and was largely drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt. And all of those rights, as human rights, are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, onto which the United States signed off. It's a signatory. And so I wonder, by the Supremacy Clause, actually, whether, in fact, those are part of the Constitution and that all Americans, as well as all people in the world, should be entitled to those things as human rights. And that includes a beautiful environment and a healthy environment as well.
And how about a climate that we can live in, because it's terrible and terrifying of what's going on in the Midwest now. I mean, in Japan, the heat wave.
Everywhere.
I mean, everywhere. It's a real crisis.
Yeah, I've just developed a talk called New Deal 1.0 was green from the get-go. And when you actually look at the New Deal, in fact, it was very advanced for its time, especially the Civilian Conservation Corps, which planted over 3.5 million trees, which are now, if they're still standing, they're 80 years old. And just imagine the carbon sequestration of 3.5 billion trees, let alone what it's done for wildlife, for example. So, yeah, I mean, they were on the right path, with a few exceptions, like some of the giant dams that they built, which caused tremendous environmental havoc. But we can correct those mistakes. We need to do it again. We need to do it better, though.
Now, there have been some articles in the international press, including The Guardian, that you had some problem with, and why don't you talk about that article?
Well, there was an article about the controversy at George Washington High School, and it had a number of factual errors in it, and I was wondering. I subscribe to The Guardian. I love The Guardian as a paper, but I was wondering if they still have fact checkers, actually, especially because the first illustration in it, which purported to be one of Arnautoff's murals, was not even that. I think it's Dewey Crumpler's, but it would lead you to believe that the author of that article had taken a photograph of it at George Washington High School, and it's not an Arnautoff mural. I'm not even sure that he knew that it was not an Arnautoff mural.
And he was doing an article on the mural controversy at George Washington High.
Mm-hmm. And no, it looks like a direct knockoff of a Diego Rivera mural, in fact, which is not the way that Arnautoff painted. And I mean, that's the irony, because Arnautoff had worked with Rivera. He knew his work, but he went off in his own way. He didn't do things like Rivera, but he was very sympathetic to him. Dewey Crumpler, in his mural, did a mural which is very much influenced by Rivera. And that was the one that led off this article about the controversy about the Arnautoff murals, but it was not identified as such.
And the end of the article says it's a hit on you.
Well, yeah, it wound up by quoting me as saying, but then I'm white and privileged, which I thought in a way was kind of castrating to me, because yes, I am white and privileged, but I said it somewhat ironically, but of course it doesn't come off unless it's in context as being that. But I have to honestly admit that I am white and privileged too. I'm speaking of it from that. I had 3 years of art history at UC Berkeley, and which taught me how to see. And when I went in into the program, I looked back and I realized I was kind of blind, like most people who haven't had the advantage of having an art history education like that. When I came out, I realized that great art is multi-layered, and that you have to learn to see it. But that takes training. When I went in and I'd go into a museum, I would, especially in Europe, I would see all these paintings of mothers and childs, and I'd go, that's all I would see. Oh, Catholic art, mothers and child. Uh-huh. I couldn't see the difference between them, let alone the difference between various artists. All I saw was the topic. And I think that's what's going on here. The people are seeing just the very surface of that painting. What depresses me is that they got testimony from people such as Robert Cherney, Arnautoff's biographer, about what the artist's intention was, what he was trying to do, and they completely ignored it. As a matter of fact, they dismissed it altogether. And I thought that was a great disservice to a great scholar, Robert Cherney, as well as to Victor Arnautoff, too, because that was not his intention. It was quite the opposite of what they are claiming, that it glorifies genocide.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for joining us on WorkWeek Radio. We've been talking with Gray Brechin, who is a art historian, who's a geographer, and who's written some very important works, including Imperial San Francisco, about the real history of California. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek Radio.
Thanks so much, Steve.